Clickety-clack. Analog devices. Aren't they cute? Typewriters, what are those? And do not forget tortuganwordpress.com, the website that is still there to give information relating to stuff that we do. Welcome to Evolution Hour. We're now into the holiday season. There will be one show this year next week, presumably in Seattle. And then we will take 2 weeks off because both of the show times would be hitting the Christmas and New Year's thing. So then I would be resuming theoretically early in January on the weekend after that. So we'll see how that goes. Anyhow, you can tell it's Christmassy because I put my little elf on the shelf here, little briefly. One of these cute little Mark Cross, or I can't remember what the name of the fellow that made these just fantastically elaborate little things that came from a wonderful gift shop, florist place that didn't survive the pandemic. So it's a sad thing, which reminds us all that nothing lasts forever, including moi. And so the kinds of joys and delights and things that you discover, enjoy them and make the most of them. And don't assume that they're going to be around 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. So they think, oh, I'll pick that up later or something like that. And it doesn't work. Anyway, as you know, we're slogging through Titans, the book that will be putting the skivvy on the creationist notions of, let me get my little chat room up there, see if there's anybody in the room. Which is still dealing with systematic matters. And I'm trying to burrow down into their source base. As I pointed out in the previous episodes, the vast majority of the stuff that's being listed in their source citations are just themselves, including material from Sarfati. So it's a bunch of CMI propaganda, functionally. But lurking underneath that is an occasional other source or two. And under the assumption that creationists tend to manipulate material, I thought it would kind of be useful to look into it. They're still waffling on whether the kinds are really useful. And they're well aware of the fact that more or less creationism makes use of the kind at the family level, except when it isn't. So they're kind of okay with some things being at a higher systematic level. And of course, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, human beings must be their own discrete kind, even though that's dropping it down to the species level. In fact, arguably, humans are the only species that creationists in the modern context are willing to entertain is what would be called in the Barrowman biz, the hollow Barrowman thing. I'm waiting to see my chat coming up, and it's still not arising properly. That may be the difficulties with the gizmo. So anyway, along the way, they source drop an article by Peter Harrison in 2009, Zygon, which is a kind of conservative theological journal that flirts a little bit with intelligent design stuff now and then. Philip Johnson's environment in that pops up occasionally in that frame. But it's a lot of stuff on a lot of different religious issues. And it was being source cited only because of the allusion to Carl Linnaeus as the second Adam. Yippee-you. That he was producing this new taxonomy. Well, as it turns out, the article is actually much more interesting than the little brief squib that Sarfati and Tay were doing. Was first of all noting that the claim that Linnaeus was trying to be the second Adam was actually an insult that was thrown at him by a contemporary taxonomist of the time who didn't like how Carl Linnaeus was kind of dumping down some of his species designations to mere varieties. So right off the bat, I'm thinking, this is kind of interesting. There's more to it than that. And it traced the shift from the medieval Catholic interpretation of nature as embodying divine principles, which always came at a expense of being able to, you weren't ever really going to be able to work out a systematics that way, because animals only were seen as archetypes of divine providence or the conceptions of things that don't have anything to do with any systematics. And as you moved into the Reformation period, you found that they were replacing that with a new modality where Adam was kind of the first scientist because he was naming all of the animals. And Reformation thinkers just were fascinated by that and connecting it up with the whole notion of language and what terms were used to describe stuff. And so this new systematics was kind of a way in their minds to recapture a pre-Babel understanding that Adam would have had at creation by trying to find kind of a universal language that would apply, that everyone could see. And of course, mathematics being that, there was that element that was skating along to the side. So Linnaeus and other efforts from that period were kind of striving for rough approximations to ascertain Adam's original perfect description of the original created kinds. Remember, the time they were living in, there were a lot fewer kinds to contend with, and they didn't have to grapple with the issue of whether or not species were kinds. There were sufficiently few of them that up until that period, it was possible to imagine that maybe the kinds that were on the ark were in fact just species. And it was only in the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century that this escalating exploration began to discover more and more and more species, to where it became untenable to be able to think that only species could be put on the ark. There wouldn't be enough room. So that kind of went into limbo until Marsh and eventually the baraminologist. Marsh is in the 1940s, really, and baraminology is popping along in the 1990s to kind of fill that in, and that's the status that we're in today. So far, I haven't been seeing much in the way of citing the baraminology technical literature. Memory serves me, virtually none of it is done by Sarfati and Tay. So they're not going to be able to deal with that from their own in-house apologetics. And I'm suspecting they will be very, very circumspect if some of that apologetics is conflicting with their notions of what the created kinds are and what was on the ark. Because they're dealing only with dinosaurs, there's very little baraminology work on that subject. And they don't have to worry about Todd Wood or Kurt Wise or somebody weighing in on it because they haven't dealt with it. So it's an interesting selection game that I'm going to be intrigued to see what's happening. At the moment, they're still running about 55, 60% of their sources are just creationist stuff. And as I'll be discussing next week, they'll have some misrepresentation of some new sources to go on. Now, the other half, normally I reserve part 2 for some screwball creationist who is saying some dumb thing that's outside of the purview of the Sarfati and Tay book or whatever book I'm reviewing. This time it's a pure science thing. And I was prodded into this because our dear friend Erica Gutsick-Gibbon did a just splendid little video a ways back on summarizing the whole mass extinction issue, and was drawing upon some very new material that bore upon my understanding of what were the main causes of mass extinction events. You'll find that I'd already had a big tip 1.2 at that website I keep pointing to at the beginning of the stories, tortuganwordpress.com, and that I think the last modification of it I made was about 2017, 2018, something like that, because there's been slight little quibbles back and forth about Chicxulub and the Cretaceous extinction, but there hadn't been a great deal that was changing the main premise that most all of the mass extinctions were being triggered by magma plume eruptions that were destabilizing the ocean, and they were destabilizing the atmosphere, and sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, changing temperature fluctuations and all sorts of stuff. And the one standout in this was the Ordovician, which had been some speculation that there might have been a connection with a possible supernova that cascaded through the system. That is the reason why the marine extinctions tend to be in things towards the surface rather than deep benthic forms and so forth. Well, some new wrinkles have changed that. It appears that volcanoes get to come back into the picture because of Bond and Graspy from 2020 on the late Ordovician mass extinction caused by volcanism, warming, and anoxia, not cooling and glaciation. And it revived connections to a lot of underappreciated data on ashfall record that was preserved in the geological record, but people hadn't connected the dots together much up until just recently. And there's a brand new paper, Longman 2021, at the preliminary proof form of its up at National Geographic that's further connecting that to phosphorus nutrient effects, explaining why the marine extinctions happened in pulses. So it looks like we're now in the stage where all of the big mass extinctions are traceable to magma plumes with an occasional asteroid impact along the side. No, this is not to say that the asteroid impact for the KT didn't happen or that it wasn't the coup de grace. And you still get fistfights going between the volcanic Deccan Traps crowd and the Chicxulub impact people as to, well, which one's more important or which one's the actual? Well, excuse me, it can be both. And that goes back to Jackson's phrase about monocausism, that don't assume that there's only a single cause for something. I'm still waiting for my chat overlay to materialize, and it hasn't. So if anybody has been putting comments in on the field, I apologize for not dealing with them, because I'm just seeing a little swirly circle go around on that. So anyway, it's a really interesting topic about why mass extinctions destabilize things and how gigantic magma plume issues can be. Volcanism, just to put it into perspective, I lived through the Mount St. Helens eruption, which is just a little tiny little pimple volcano, goes pip. And that's small potatoes compared to Tambora or, well, even Krakatoa is fairly small scale. And Santorini is another very large eruption. And so you've got ones that have, most of which are occurring before human cultures have gotten to the point where they were writing things down, or in some cases, many cases, most cases, occurring before there were any human beings to pay any attention to them at all. But magma plumes are an entirely different kettle of fish. So it's like imagining 100 Mount St. Helens going off at the same time for decades. And that is just a whole order of magnitude more serious. The Siberian traps that are related to the giant Permian extinction are just enormous. And there's stuff involving how they were setting forests on fire and just creating such an enormous feedback system that was just crashing everything more severely than any other mass extinction. Even the insects had trouble during the Permian mass extinction. And so now to find the Ordovician coming into that as well puts into perspective those giant pulses that are happening. Those kinds of processes, by the way, would presumably have been going on for the billions of years prior to the ones that we're seeing in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. But because there was no life on the surface during those things, the only way that it could come into an impact is how it would be affecting ocean chemistry, which would be affecting bacterial life in the sea. And that stuff doesn't leave fossils in the way that you'd like. So it's entirely possible that magma plume events have been affecting life long before we can spot mass extinctions, because we're dealing with microbial life forms that may even have an impact on invisible extinctions that could have been taking place with massive bacterial crashes long before multicellularity that ultimately have affected the long-term history of the planet. as an example that I mentioned previously, that it's not at all implausible to me that some bacterial lineages may have gone completely extinct. And the one that's the most plausible is whether or not mitochondria developed from a bacterial lineage which is no longer here. And that's why it's so difficult. We're only be able to looking at its surviving cousins that have features, some of which fit the mitochondrial endosymbiont ancestor, and others are just as plausible. So there's like two competing bacterial groups that are typically put forward as the likely spot that was the generator of mitochondria. This is different from cyanobacteria and chloroplasts, where there's no significant debate in the evolutionary community that cyanobacteria are derived, chloroplasts in plants are derived from cyanobacteria, which are still around and doing just fine, thank you, for us to look at in detail. So that's one of my little hypotheses of what's on. I'm trying to fill in. As a historian, I'm naturally aware of the absence of data. Doesn't mean there wasn't data there. It just means you can't see it because it's gone. And from the history of playing cards and chess and other things that I've been intrigued with over the years, it's just, as a historian, there's tons of things where you just don't have a data field to be able to look at, even though stuff would have happened. And so that long stretch of time during which you find eukaryotes developing and multicellularity developing before the Ediacara Cambrian thing, where multicellular organisms really pick up and they start become big enough that you can see them without a microscope. That there's billions of years of stuff going on in there. And it makes much more sense to me that there is a dynamic that's happening that is possibly traceable, and somebody that has greater familiarity with a lot of the proxy material in geology can weigh in at some point in commentary on the channel or whatever, or get in contact with me and say, oh, this is the paper that you need to look at. The kinds of proxies that you do in evaluating what the environment was going on, what kind of bacteria were existing, what redox levels, what were the phosphorus levels, what were the fluctuations of stuff eroding off of the continents, of which there would have been no life on it at that time. And so those sort of proxy material comes up in some context, but without knowing how that's impacting the organisms that are living in the sea at that stage, figuring out what's happening in a mass extinction context is very, very difficult. Plus, you have the difficulties of working out the paleocontinents. It looks like supercontinents are forming in about a 700 million year cycle. And so there's more than enough room for there to have been multiple supercontinents existing way before Rodinia. I think, can't remember whether Columbia or there's a couple names that have been bandied about at least big continental masses that predate Rodinia. And there could have been full out massive supercontinents that existed, of which lots of they've broken up, there have been rifting, there's been subduction, and all we're seeing are the tiny little slivers of them left over that are popping up in whatever spots that we can see Precambrian rocks. We know that sort of thing was going on more recently because of where I live, which is in the Pacific Northwest. And as Nick Zentner has been lecturing in great detail on his courses down there at Central Washington University about the various exotic terrains that exist in the Pacific Northwest, which are effectively fragments of things that are reflecting the geology of places that don't exist anymore. All we're seeing is the little leftovers. There was presumably a big seamount volcanic thing that called Silesia. Bits and pieces of it are found sprinkled around through the Cascades and that on the Pacific Northwest. And there's still big debates about whether or not the Baja BC maneuvers and other things happening. Well, there's no reason to think that there haven't been substantial physical spaces that the farther you get down into more recent times, the more likely you are that there was going to be life on those kinds of real estate, and that stuff went on that's gone because the land that it's on gets subducted and disappeared completely. So there's a lost history of life that we can see just the shadows of by inference. We'll be able to probably extend some of that boundary layer geologically back another billion years, maybe, as they do more deep scanning of the planets to detect these squiggly bits that are the leftovers of subduction events. So I suspect, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, there's going to be a clearer sense of at least pieces of what was going on in the period prior to Virginia. So I'll keep an eye out on that little bit. Okay, I'm still not seeing my chat overlay. The poor little thing. It's just a circle going around and around and around. I'm terribly sorry on that little front. Do take a look at I'll be putting the link into Erica's video, because she did just a really nice summary of all of those little mass extinction events. And it's a useful benchmark for your map of time, because we're talking about stuff that's the Ordovician is the oldest of the great mass extinctions. She mentions bits about the Ediacara period where it's very putatively likely, and I'm inclined to agree, that there was a big mass extinction that was going on there entirely in the oceans, because there was nothing living on the surface at this time, other than bacteria, probably, fungi and stuff. You can't stop them little bastards. It has that same kind of extinction pulse thing, which I refer to in the tip 1.2 about the gap line between when the extinction occurs and what gets surviving through it, and then this kind of lull, because it takes time for evolution to kick in terms of mutations and variations and modifications. So you have a thing where a lot of the new diversity that comes along after a mass extinction is a long way down the road, because it just doesn't spring out in the middle of nowhere, which, if you were talking a designer, and why would they have the system fall down, go boom to begin with? That's an interesting philosophical position. But why then, if it's purely design? Yeah, I'm seeing, oh, purple. Hello, purple. I'm not seeing the main text popping up. Let me see if I can deactivate this temporarily. Click it back in place. Yeah, I'm seeing the stuff showing up on the little itty bitty screen, but not on the big chat window that I can actually read much of what it's saying. So anyway, I see a good morning and a greeting. So at least you're there, purple. I can at least acknowledge your existence. And so that it's that mass extinction frame that you can see, and Erica's treatment of it dives into an awful lot of the ocean chemistry issue and the faunal turnovers and all the rest. That it's a handy way of keeping the benchmarks of what life turnovers were happening. And that therefore connects up with the geology and the paleontology and ecology and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's, if you remember, not just the super duper famous mass extinction of the dinosaurs, but all those previous ones as well, that helps connect an awful lot of dots and helps clarify one's map of time on it. The two papers will be really neat little material on there, because of course they're also alluding to the forensics of how you go about identifying and synchronizing what is happening in a mass extinction and how you can trace and connect it to the geologic phenomenon, as well as establishing that the geological phenomenon was happening. And there again, there's a lot of things that are proxies when they're looking at isotope ratios and a whole bunch of other things. So it's a delicious geological detective story that goes through in this area, which may be compared to the pile of fluff that occurs in the creationist context with their hypercataclysm. I was just finishing up the task that I had downloaded while I was on the Thanksgiving vacation, the 1,000-page monstrosity at the latest creationism conference that took place in 2023. And there are dozens of papers in this stuff. And I finally started to get them cataloged and organized and figuring out what I'm going to be alluding to in volume 2 of the rocks were there, and such like. And there's a bunch of juicy material in there on the confusion in the young Earth creationists over when the flood started and stopped in the geologic record, particularly the stopping part. And so you've got teams of people, the Clary bunch that come from ICR, are pushing late into the Cenozoic frame, whereas the Answers in Genesis crowd and that is going, not really. And then there are a bunch of new names that are popping up that I've added to my catalog listing that haven't yet materialized in terms of technical papers that are available other than abstracts. There's a big chunk of just allusions to presentations, I guess, but there's only an abstract available of it at this creationism conference. And I've encountered about a dozen or more names of people adding on to the field. Some of them in technical things, some of them are like computer engineers, and some of them, teaching at like Loma Linda, which is an Adventist university. And so it's a bunch of upcoming folk whose names may or may not be dealing with things in future. We'll be alluding to a chunk of that stuff. It was heavily weighted on to the sciences. There was only a couple stuff in there that was trying to make sense of the biblical interaction with the real world, like Egypt and archaeology material and that sort of stuff. Not a heck of a lot on that. You had some things from Jeffrey Tompkins, and I can't recall. I don't think anything from Nathaniel Jensen and that side of things. But you get quite a lot of Todd Wood and Kurt Wise and that crowd, McLean and others. There's a new analysis of supposedly the baraminology for archosaurs, a preliminary analysis that will be relevant because of the discussion of what critters are on board the Ark at the Ark encounters. So we want to compare that material. And then some cute stuff on human evolution, because it looks like though they might, Kurt Wise and company cannot avoid dragging Australopithecus sediba into the human holobaramin. And so there's still a great deal of consternation and teeth gnashing about that because of the squishy nature of their holobaramin, which includes even Homo habilis is being dragged in there. And so there's enough charts and stuff. And also there's a couple instances of where they're dealing with dates for the flood and relating it to the various textual methods for figuring out when the flood took place according to the Bible, that again conflict with that benchmark 2348 BCE model that Usher favored, and that is the standard number waved around at Answers in Genesis, but only one of many. So I think everyone's going to have a field day seeing just how big the range is of when the flood took place according to the Bible from Bible believers. It's beyond just a few centuries. It spills out thousands of years in some cases. Oh, we're seeing more little comments that I can barely read. There we go. Okay. Yes, something about ancestors. I apologize, completely purple. I cannot see that closer because these little tiny little texts that's not showing up in the chat overlay. Rats. Anyhow, all of that material we'll be dealing with. Presumably, they tend to have these conferences fairly infrequently. The 2023 one, the last one, big one, was in 2018. So when about the time lag between each one of these major conferences and the number of papers that are presented, it's not a hell of a lot. It's whittling down to just a few papers from per year on that, and is probably less prolific than Answers Research Journal or the Journal of Creation, which is still churning stuff out. And there's a little bit of stuff in the Creation Research Society quarterly. Meanwhile, the intelligent design movement has practically gone catatonic I'm still awaiting that stupid paper that Gunter Beckley and Huckler, or whatever his name was, and I think they had a couple other potential co-authors on whales and proving that whales couldn't have evolved. It's been now, I think, 5 years that Erica was talking with Beckley about this thing, that it sounded like it was just about ready to go. And I haven't heard hide nor hair of it since. Supposedly he was going to send the draft of it to Erica to see. I haven't heard anything from that angle, so it looks like it's just been floating in limbo. The reason why I'm anxious to see a thing like that is to see what sources they're drawing on, what information are they drawing on, what information they are leaving out, how much of it's troping the arguments of little guy that's flirting around the intelligent design movement that he's done videos on von Sternberg on whale evolution, and all it has been are videos without references. So it's very difficult to pin down what connection his assertions are with the actual data points. So that's why I was really looking forward to this thing. Jackson and I are going to be having quite a big section on whale evolution and how creationists have wiffle-waffled around whale evolution in volume 2 of the Rocks Were There. So keep that one going. Well, anyway, that I think covers a great deal. And say a great big Merry Christmas to our little elf. Isn't he a cute little fellow? Of course, he runs around like crazy person when you turn your back on him. You got to watch out about these little critters. None of these little minor league elves on the shelf. I go for the full out killer. So anyway, we'll catch you next week, presumably from Seattle. And then remember, the next 2 weeks, Christmas and New Year's, are no RJ blither blather. I know the world is going to have to get along for a couple of weeks without my wisdom, but I think it's done that for a long time before that, and we'll presumably have millennia, billions, trillions of years of not paying attention to me in future to come. So we'll deal with it as we can. Anyway, weather looks crappy in an awful lot of places, in floods up in the Northeast, and killer tornadoes down in the South, and a bunch of flooding over. I'm glad I wasn't going over to Seattle this week. Yuck. It would have been a real mess. Hopefully, cross fingers, the passes will be nice and comfy when I go over at the end of the week, and then we'll be seeing what happens when we're there. So everybody, stay safe, kids. I'll keep an eye out for wooden penguins, especially armed ones, and we'll see you next week. And everybody stay safe. Concluding the stream. Oh, wait a minute. Not concluding the stream. I need to put up my patrons. Idiot. Call attention to the people without whom it would be so much more difficult to be able to do this every week. Eric Suris, our researchers, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Apology, Ralph Pledger, Benjamin Sampson, Slav Studio, DM-Wing, our assistant researchers, Command Cyborg, Doranku, Scott Duke, Christopher Johnson, the Lavender Lady, our friends, Antoine Botts, Marigale Beddoes, My Unfinished Journey, Nana, Morton Nielsen, Bo Rasmussen, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams, and our various legacy patrons who helped at one time or another whenever they could. I'm entirely grateful to every word and every bit that has graced your support. It shows that I'm having an impact, even if it's not as tidal wave-ish as I would like to see, but I'm still plugging away at it. We've got more books to write. Now let's put up a blurb advertising said book to conclude the show. My little windows over here. I'm an old person, and I have to get my little windows. There we go. Let's put that over there. And And there is the advert for The Rocks Were There, Volume 1. Jackson and I are very proud of it. We will be just as proud of Volume 2 that we're working on. And also, don't forget Evelyn Slam Dunk, my own prior work. And don't forget, there's fiction to boot. If you like mystery, science fiction, adventure, historical fiction, fun stuff with Phileas Fogg and all the merry crew of the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg stories. As always, I stick the links to that as well as to the Patreon for those who want to join the Patreon parade and feel that sustaining my blither blather every week is something that you could help on. We'll see how things are going. 2023 has had its ups and downs, and let us hope that 2024 is not as worrisome as it could be, because it's an election year and a lot of crazy things are probably going to be happening. So anyway, catch you next week, everybody.